Hi, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our pizza making workshop with Karishma of the Cooking Collective. We're gonna just very quickly go over the housekeeping rules again. We have the chat box. Please utilize it for questions, and we'll be sure they get asked. Also, we're asking people, before you eat your pizza, can you take a picture of it and post it on your social media and tag at Home Cooking Collective, which is Karishma's company and her site, and also hashtag Brandeis Women. And if you're a member of our Facebook group, if you could post it on our Facebook group, we would love to see the pizzas. But that would be a lot of fun for us. So we're going to remind you of that again, and we'll put it in the chat. But if you could do that, that would be great. I'm going to turn the program over to Rebecca, who was helping us yesterday with the questions. Rebecca Bachman is the national co-chair of the BOLD group, and she is on the Brandeis alumni board. She's also a foodie and introduced me to a great scones place when I moved here from New York. To New York from LA. And that's it, Rebecca, 2013, is that right?
Yes.
I'm turning it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Amy, and welcome back, everyone. I did see a question in the chat already about if someone missed part 1, can we catch up? And will there be a recording? There will be recordings of both. And another housekeeping detail, we are currently recording this session. Before I kick it off and take it over to Karishma, I just want to thank her once again for leading part 2 of her pizza making workshop series for Brandeis Women. Karishma's Brandeis class of 2015, and she's the founder of the Home Cooking Collective, which is a community for aspiring cooks to learn how to make delicious food through high quality workshops, guides, and recipes. And I think we all saw from yesterday how high quality her workshops are. I know I learned a lot. And I encourage you, we'll post it in the chat, but I encourage you to follow her social media channels. As Amy mentioned, tag her in what you've made tonight. And also keep an eye out for other classes that she leads. And if you're ever looking for private cooking workshops, she offers those as well. But I'm going to pass it off to Karishma. I will be moderating any questions that come up in the chat, and we'll make sure that they all get answered. Thank you guys all for being here, and take it away, Karishma.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm really excited for day 2 of our pizza workshop. So we're actually going to be able to cook and eat our pizza today, which is very exciting. The first thing that I want to just, make sure is by now you should have had your dough out of the fridge for about, at least 45 minutes. If it's covered right now, that's totally fine. We'll uncover it in a few minutes. But if you haven't already, make sure that you take your pizza dough out of the fridge. It needs time to come back to room temperature before we stretch it out and bake it. And the second thing is you should also have preheated your oven. So the oven should be at the highest temperature that it can go to. For me, that's about 550 degrees. For you, it could be 500. It could be lower than that. And I have the equipment that I'm going to actually be baking my pizza on. So I'm using a baking steel. But if you're using like a pizza stone, or if you're using a baking sheet, that should also be in the oven. And I have mine on a middle rack, a middle, or like the bottom third of your oven is either of those totally works. But make sure that that equipment and your oven is preheating right now.
Karishma, we have one question in the chat already. My dough didn't grow very much. It spread out a little, but that's it. Will it still work? And Francine, I encourage you to go on video and hold up your dough so that Karishma can take a look while you answer.
Yeah, let me take a look. I wouldn't be too concerned. It's okay if it didn't grow too much. It doesn't always like fully double in size. Even if like mine, for example, also is, relatively, it looks kind of like this. and it's spread out a little, but it will also continue spreading it out at room temperature and when you stretch it out. Yeah, that looks okay to me. The other thing that you kind of like you can do is you can just very gently feel your dough. So if your dough is feeling really, really cold, it might just need a little bit more time to come to room temperature. And as it comes to room temperature, it's going to spread out a little bit more, but it shouldn't be like, it's not going to be like a really, large, thin circle yet. That's going to happen from us actually stretching out our dough. All right, so we'll put our dough to the side for now. And what we're gonna do first is we're just gonna get all of our toppings and our sauce ready. And so then once we have all of our sauce and toppings ready, then we'll be ready to actually work with our dough to stretch it out and top it. So we are making a margarita pizza today. And traditionally, a margarita pizza is really simple. And so the idea is that you have a sauce, which is made of fresh tomatoes. And so that's why I had sort of asked for, a can of whole peeled tomatoes or tomato passata, which is a puree. Both of those, again, are kind of, they're not cooked. We're not going to cook them down. That's something that you might use for example, like a New York style pizza dough. But for a margarita pizza, we're really just going to have like this nice raw sauce, and you really want to be able to highlight that freshness of the tomatoes. So depending on what you have, you can either have I have this, this came from like a can of whole peeled tomatoes. You can see I have like my separate tomatoes, and then there's some sauce at the bottom. Or you might have tomato passata, which again is just like an Italian tomato puree. And so it's already been pureed, it's nice and thick. So that's kind of the sauce. And then similarly with the rest of your toppings. So, if you have cheese, we're using mozzarella cheese, but throughout this whole thing for margarita pizza, it's all about keeping it simple. You can definitely add other toppings, but the biggest thing to make sure is to not overload your pizza with a ton of toppings, because the more you weigh it down, the harder it is to work with it. The idea is kind of keeping your toppings lighter, so that you can really also just taste that crust and it doesn't get soggy. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to prepare our sauce. Now, if you have this already pureed tomato sauce known as the passata, all you need to do for both of these, we really only need about a cup of sauce total. So if you have the pureed passata, what you're going to do is just pour it into like a measuring cup or a bowl. Again, you just need 1 cup of it. And then all you're going to do to add to that is you're going to add a little bit of olive oil and a little bit of salt just to taste. So that's for the passata. You don't need to blend it, obviously, because it's already blended. So you're just going to be adding salt and a little bit of olive oil to taste. Now, if you are using a can of whole peeled tomatoes, for example, you can see, as I mentioned, there's like these physical tomato pieces, and there's also that kind of liquid. So what you're going to do is you're just going to blend the actual physical tomatoes. You don't want to blend the liquid that it's in, because it's going to be too liquidy. It's going to be too runny. So again, you only need about a cup of these actual solid tomatoes for your sauce. And so I would just put them in either a blender or a food processor. And you can just blend it until it just comes together. It's just barely homogeneous. With a food processor, you can pulse it a few times. With a blender, just be careful not to overblend it, because again, it can get a little bit too liquidy if that's the case. So you're really just blending it for a few seconds just until it comes together. So I will demonstrate. I am actually going to just, I don't have a full cup of my whole peeled tomatoes, but I'll just show you what I would do. I just have my blender right here. And I'm just going to, again, whiz it a couple of times until the sauce kind of comes together. And so you can see, again, you want to have kind of a thicker puree. You don't want it to be too liquidy. You want kind of the consistency of this passata or something kind of that looks like this, that's on the thicker side. If for any reason your sauce does, sometimes just based on the tomatoes that you have, it can be a little bit more liquidy. So if when you blend your sauce, it does look more liquidy, what you can do is you can, if you have like a fine sieve, you can strain your sauce over a bowl just to get rid of some of that really thin liquid. And so then you're left with a thicker puree. So that's what I would recommend if it comes out a little bit looser, but definitely don't over blend it. You don't need to blend it for more than, you know, a few seconds or so until it comes together. And so I have my passata that I have in my cup, and I'm just going to, again, season it with a little bit of olive oil and a little bit of salt. And you're gonna do the same thing if you have those whole peeled tomatoes. You're also gonna season them with a little bit of olive oil and salt after you blend it up. Any questions on the sauce or any of the setup that we have so far? Anything about the dough or the oven before we kind of get the rest of the ingredients ready?
No questions in the chat.
Okay, awesome. So I assume people are probably going and making their sauce.
I spoke too soon. How much oil and how much salt?
So this is really up to your taste preference. So like I would probably do just a sprinkle of salt and maybe like a teaspoon of olive oil to start, but it's really up to your preference. You're really just adding a little bit of salt just to kind of bring out the flavor of the tomato, and a little bit of oil as well, just to cut the acidity.
Where's it? How do I do that? Yes, of course.
The next question in the chat is, would it be okay to add oregano or other spices to the sauce?
Yes, you know, if you like sauce to have like oregano, garlic powder, red pepper flakes, I don't want you to feel like limited by that. So whatever, you know, you like, you can add to the sauce. The only thing I would say is like, yeah, so traditionally the sauce is just tomatoes, olive oil, and salt. So if you want to keep it traditional, do that. But if you like garlic powder, if you want to make it a little spicy, I often, you know, add that stuff as well every so often to my sauce. So feel free. This is like today is a lot less technical and precise than yesterday. It's a lot more about experimenting and kind of using what you have.
A couple of other questions. Is it a problem if the cheese is wet inside?
Oh, that's a good question. So if your cheese is wet inside, like if it feels quite wet to the touch, what you can do is use like a paper towel and just dab it. So you want to make sure that it is as dry as possible, just because if it is super wet, then it can kind of like ooze that liquid over your pizza and make it a little bit soggy. But, you know, like some mozzarella just happens to be a little bit wetter. So just do your best to pat it dry. That's what I would recommend.
Is the 1 cup of sauce what is needed for 2 pizzas or just for 1?
The 1 cup of sauce is for both pizzas. That's a good question.
What is the purpose of adding olive oil to the sauce?
That's a good question. Yeah, so the purpose of adding olive oil to the sauce is just to kind of remove some of the harsher acidity of the tomato sauce. So by itself, especially this can also differ on the type of canned tomatoes that you have. It can be quite acidic. And so adding the olive oil gives a little bit of fat, a little bit more like a little bit richness that like cuts that acidity. So for example, if you didn't have olive oil, you absolutely don't need to add it. I just think that it kind of makes the sauce a little bit tastier.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. All right, so you have your 1 cup of sauce. And as I mentioned, the whole thing with the margherita pizza is that you're really using small amounts of the toppings, a lot less than you might think. And so that's also why you're really only using about a cup of sauce for your pizza. So on to the other toppings. So we have our mozzarella. And so, yeah, everyone might have different types of mozzarella. So there are mozzarellas that are like part skim, so they're much firmer and they're like a little bit saltier. There's mozzarellas that are more liquidy. As I mentioned, if your mozzarella is liquidy, you can drain it a little bit in a fine sieve, or you can pat it down with paper towel or wrap it in a paper towel just to get some of that excess moisture out. And then what I like to do is, the easiest thing for my mozzarella is I really just take it. So if I have a ball of mozzarella, I just tear it into small pieces. So these are just kind of like bite-sized pieces. They're probably between like a 1/2 inch and 1.5 inches long. I find that this is the easiest way to kind of, cut up your mozzarella. Some people also like to cut it into cubes. I think with the tearing, it also makes it a little bit easier. Again, you have like less weight on your pizza with like a sort of like a shred of mozzarella as opposed to like a chunkier cube. But I've done both of those. So I think tearing is like the easiest thing to do. But some people also just like to slice it. So totally up to you. And then if you have basil, some basil leaves, and then the last piece is just, I marked this as optional, but if you have any sort of like pecorino cheese or Parmigiano Reggiano, just having a handful of freshly grated cheese that you can put on top your pizza when it comes out is also a really nice add. And then we'll also put, just a little drizzle of olive oil on top of our pizza before we bake it. But again, the big kind of key items that we need is our blended sauce, our mozzarella cheese that's torn into shreds or sliced, and then our basil, if you have it, and like a little bit of cheese. So I'll give everyone a couple of minutes to, get your toppings ready. What I like to do is I like to put them in these prep bowls if you have them, or just on a plate. So you have everything ready to go. And when you're building your pizza, you can just take something from the plate and really easily and quickly put it on. So I have, my toppings and I have my sauce. So I'm almost ready to go and get my pizza stretched. And if you have any other toppings, if you have, any like pre-cooked meat, pepperoni, you can add other toppings as well. I highly recommend that, especially if, you're making both pizzas today. You can, use whatever toppings you have at home.
Another question came up. Do you chop the basil or use it whole?
Yeah, so for the basil, if they're really big pieces, you can chop it. I would do it right at the last minute so that the basil doesn't turn, because it can sort of turn black. But if they're smaller pieces, you can just keep them whole. And the thing with the basil as well is that we are gonna put it on our pizza after our pizza comes out of the oven. Because we are using our home oven and it's gonna take a little bit of time for our pizza to cook. By the time your pizza is cooked, if you put the basil on while it's cooking in the oven, it can kind of dry out and burn. So I recommend holding off to put the basil on top just as a garnish once it comes out of the oven. And again, if they're smaller pieces, you can just use them whole. For larger pieces, you can cut them.
And can you use onion or mushrooms as toppings?
Yes, absolutely. So any toppings that you want, you can feel free to use. For something like onions or mushrooms, you may want to actually pre-cook them just so that depending on how long it takes. So for example, in my oven, it only takes about 5 minutes max to cook my pizza. And so my vegetables may not be fully cooked. So I prefer to pre-cook them, especially if they're like wetter vegetables that release liquid. Pre-cook them, get all that liquid out, and then top your pizza with your already pre-cooked vegetables. All right. So I will give everyone a minute, but I'm gonna go ahead and kind of get set up with the dough portion of getting my dough ready to be stretched. So I think the easiest thing that will kind of make it easier for everyone else to follow along is I'm going to show you how I stretch, top, and bake my first pizza. And so you can do this while you're getting the rest of your ingredients ready. And then for when I make my second pizza, we can kind of do it along together. That way you're able to absorb the information from the first piece. You can ask any questions before you go ahead and do it yourself. And the biggest thing about, this portion is that everyone kind of has different equipment. So some people might have a pizza stone, some people might just be using a baking sheet. So I'll talk through kind of like what you do if you have different equipment, but this would be a good time while I'm doing this first round and you're observing. If you have questions about your equipment and how to use it, feel free to enter those into the chat. So I have my pizza dough ball, and what I'm going to do is, depending on what you're using, so I have, this pizza peel here. It's a wooden pizza peel. You can also use a metal one. And this peel is a way you can build your pizza on it and use it to shimmy your pizza into the oven. Now, if you don't have a peel, you can use a piece of parchment paper. And the basic difference between the two of these is that if you're using the parchment paper, you can actually directly build your pizza on the parchment. And so you don't have to worry as much about like your pizza dough sticking to the parchment or getting it on and off. And so you don't have to worry as much about using the right amount of flour, checking that it's sticking. When I'll show you kind of how this looks like, but when you're building it on top of the parchment, that parchment with the pizza will go directly into the oven. So you don't have to worry about, if your dough is stuck to the parchment. With a peel, you have to make sure that you have enough flour. And again, that your dough is not too wet, that you're not putting too many toppings on. Otherwise, your pizza can stick to the peel. So when you're using a peel, it's really important that you keep it well floured and that you check every so often that it's not sticking. So I'm gonna, in this demonstration, kind of show you how both of those work. With the parchment and with the peel, I do recommend getting a bowl of flour that you can dip your pizza in on both sides to make sure it's coated. Again, that really helps. It's more for the peel, but it really helps to make sure that your pizza is not going to stick to the peel. And so what I have here is just a mix of the 00 flour, and I also have some semolina flour. Some people will use cornmeal, some people will use just regular flour. So whatever you have is totally fine. If you only have all-purpose flour, you can just use all-purpose flour. The reason I use the mix of both is that semolina flour is kind of like cornmeal in that it's a little bit more coarse. And so it doesn't cake on to your pizza in the same way, versus something like 00 flour is really nice that it really helps eliminate sticking. But if you put too much on, then your pizza can taste very floury. So that's kind of why I like to use the mix. And if you are using a peel today and you're a beginner to using a peel, I definitely recommend using more flour than you might think, just to start, so that you have kind of a baseline. And the worst thing is to have your pizza stick to your peel. So use a little bit more, keep checking that it's not sticking. And then as you get more comfortable, you can learn to use less flour. So as I mentioned, I'm going to first dip my pizza on both sides into the flour. And the biggest thing that you want to make sure at this process is you've kind of waited again for 24 hours for your dough to rise. You've formed it into these really nice dough balls. So the worst thing that could happen is if you pull it out, and as you're pulling it out, you squeeze it or pinch it and it deflates. So be really cautious here. You can take your time to very gently lift your dough out of your container. So you can see I'm just putting my fingers under the dough very gently all around, just to make sure that when I actually pull it out, it doesn't stick to any corner. And then I'm just going to very gently again lift it up. and dip it in the flour on both sides. So you can see that I've dipped it in my flour. It's nicely coated on both sides. And then if I'm using the parchment, I'll put it on the parchment. If I'm going to use a peel, which I'll sort of show later in this process, but for a peel, just make sure again that you're flouring your peel nicely as well, in addition to your pizza dough ball. But for parchment, what you're going to do is first you're going to make a rim with your pizza, and you'll also do this if you have your peel as well. This process is really, we're kind of creating our crust and then going to stretch the pizza. So the biggest thing is whether you're on parchment or peel, you're going to first form a rim with your fingers to form kind of this outer crust. And so what you're essentially saying is I'm creating a barrier. I'm not going to touch this outer crust, so it's going to be nice and bubbly. And we will then sort of press out all the air in the center. So we have an outer crust that's thicker and then an inner crust that's thinner. So what I do is I just gently poke my fingers down into the dough all around. I'm about 1/2 to 2/3 of an inch from the edge of the dough. And I'm just, again, creating little depressions all around the dough. So I don't know if you can see, but you can see I've kind of, with my finger, just created a rim by pressing down and poking in this circular formation.
We have one question, Karishma, in the chat. What do you do if your dough stretches or breaks, as if you've gotten this far in the process and that happens?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if your dough, I'm wondering if it's when it's out of the container, like you're taking it out of the container or you're already stretching it. If your dough breaks, like when you're taking it out of the container, you can kind of just try to like patch it up. Don't worry about it too much.
Yes, from taking it out of the container.
Yeah. So yeah, don't worry about it too much. Maybe I could take a look.
Ian, if you want to hold your dough up for Karishma, go for it.
I was following orders and not going to do it until the second pizza. So
Okay.
I'm just anticipating failure.
Oh, okay, yeah. That's a good question. So yeah, if again, be as gentle as possible. If it does happen to kind of like get pinched or stretch or break, you can kind of do your best to compact it a little bit, especially before it goes into that flour and you douse it. You can just kind of compact it back into that circular shape. That's one thing that you can do. But yeah, definitely don't worry too much. If that happens, it's okay. Your pizza doesn't have to be like a perfect circle. It can be, like it can be a rectangle. It can be a different shape. So don't worry too much. But the other thing I was going to say is, yeah, what happens when if you like pinch it a little bit or stretches, is most likely it'll look mostly like a circle, but there might be one part of it that feels a little thinner. So what you're going to want to do is just make sure that when you're stretching your pizza, that you're not like overstretching that part that's already thinner. So the best thing is basically just making sure that you stretch the other parts, and kind of avoiding stretching the thinner part as much so that it doesn't rip or tear, if that makes sense. Okay, so I have my rim created, and now you can see I have an outer crust and I have this inner piece. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to push down into this middle section. And as I'm doing this, you will feel that, there will be some air bubbles coming out. You can feel that you're pushing that air out of the center of the dough. And some of that air will then kind of move into the crust and make your crust a little bit bigger. And some of that air will also just be stretching the pizza. So as you're just gently, I'm just using my 3 middle fingers and just gently pressing down into the center of the crust. And that's already stretching my pizza very naturally. And so then once that middle section, it doesn't need to be super thin right now because we're gonna actually fully stretch it, but you just wanna kind of make sure that you're pressing out most of the air. Once you do that, the way that you'll stretch it on your parchment is you will essentially take your two hands and you're gonna form a triangle with your hands. And your hands are gonna kind of stretch the dough in opposite directions. So I have my triangle hands, and what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna stretch the dough out. And so what I'm doing is I'm putting this triangle down and I'm stretching in opposite directions with my fingers and then rotating this parchment. So I'll show you again. I'm basically putting this triangle down, stretching the dough in opposite directions to stretch it, and then rotating. And so essentially you're gonna keep stretching your dough on your parchment until it's probably between 10 and 12 inches. So if you want a thicker dough, you can leave it at 10 inches. A thinner dough is 12 inches. And so that's really it. What you do with the parchment is you just kind of use this triangle formation and stretch the dough outwards in opposite directions and continue rotating, so you're doing that evenly. So that's the parchment. Now, if I was gonna do it on a peel, you're gonna do the exact same thing where you create that rim on the peel, and you also press down all the air in the middle of the dough. But with the peel, again, as you're doing this, you wanna make sure you just kind of, I'm essentially just shimmying my dough back and forth on the peel, and I can see that it's moving and it's not sticking. If I notice at this point that it's sticking, I can add a little bit more flour to the bottom of my peel to kind of make sure that it's not sticking. And so you can just very gently try to lift out the part that's sticking and make sure that you add a little bit more flour. At this point, this is the easiest kind of place to continue to add flour to make sure that it doesn't stick. Once you add the topping, it's a little harder. So just make sure it's generously floured, and make sure, every 30 seconds or so, you're checking and making sure that your pizza can move and stretch on the peel. Now, for the peel, you can actually use your hands and pick up the dough and stretch it. So with that, essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up my dough and I'm going to gently stretch it with my knuckles and then rotate. So I'm being really gentle here. Being gentler and while you're getting used to it will help ensure that you're not tearing the dough, but I'm essentially just holding my knuckles in the kind of middle center of the dough at the top and stretching across gently and then rotating. So what that kind of looks like in this back view is I'm holding my dough like this with my knuckles and then stretching outwards and rotating. And so that's how you would stretch your dough on the peel. You can also use a triangle method, but I find that the triangle method is a little bit easier on your parchment. And your dough, the other sign, other than just kind of the size of your dough, to know that it's ready, is that it will look, once it starts looking a little bit translucent, that means that the inner part is thin enough. You don't want, once it gets translucent, if you keep stretching it, it's gonna tear. So that's a sign as well that you're done stretching your pizza. So this is kind of the two ways that I stretch my pizza. On the parchment, again, I use the triangle method, and then on the peel, I pick it up with my hands and very gently stretch the dough. Do we have questions on this portion?
There are a bunch of questions.
Okay.
First question is, what if the dough didn't fully expand outwards because it was in a bowl that it rose, but it wasn't necessarily as flat and large?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I wouldn't worry too much if it's going to be, in that case, it'll probably be like a little bit thicker. So depending on how kind of, for example, like if you put your pizza dough in a container this narrow, the really big thing that you want to make sure is you're going to have to be a little bit more gentle when you're taking it out, just because you have like less room almost to take it out. But then if that's the case, it's fine. Then you're just going to have to do a little bit more of the air pressing in that when you're pressing out the middle to ensure that it's stretching out as much as a dough that kind of would stretch out on a plate or something. But I've worked with both doughs, like when it's like really well stretched versus when it's kind of tighter, and you just have to do a little bit more work if it's in a narrower container.
Cool. Thank you for that. So we've got 2 questions that are in the same category, so I'll ask you both.
Okay.
What if it tears and you get a rip in the dough? And then another question, I'm gonna ask you all of the questions about tears, so you can.
Yes.
So what if it tears and you get a break? I have cracks between the rim of the pizza and the base. Is that okay? And what if your dough rips as you're stretching it on the peel?
Okay. All right. So I'll handle the rips, tears questions. So first of all, I want everyone to know that it is totally normal for your dough to rip and tear, especially if you're less comfortable doing this. It's something that just happens. So don't worry too much. The biggest thing that you want to do is you can like essentially patch your dough up. So let's say that I had like a tear, for example, in the middle of my dough, like just pretend where my finger is, there's a tear. What I do is I just pick up a part of the 2 parts of the dough next to it and just pinch it together to kind of seal that tear. So that's the first thing I would do. And then depending on how big it is, you can also put a little bit more flour on the top and on the bottom of the pizza to make sure that you kind of seal, again, like sealing that tear. So first pinch it and then put a little bit more flour down. That's the biggest thing. And also make sure like in that section that you have the tear that you don't overload it again with like a ton of toppings or a ton of weight. Especially if it's a really tiny tear, you can even almost like avoid that section and put like very little, if maybe no sauce or something in that one section to avoid that. If you're building it on parchment, you don't have to worry as much because again, like it's going on in the oven with the parchment. But if you get a tear on your peel, you definitely want to make sure that you do this full like pinching the dough together, putting the flour on the top and the bottom. And you'll know if it hasn't been sealed because when you shimmy your pizza, it'll get stuck there. So you're going to have to add a little bit more flour to ensure that it doesn't do that. But yeah, like don't worry too much. I mean, it is something that can happen. So again, like take this day as like a day to experiment, and you can patch up a tear. I wouldn't worry too much. And worst case, if you're stretching it and you get a tear, the other thing that you kind of want to make sure is that it's really hard to like keep stretching it because you can often like reopen that tear again. So hopefully at that point your dough is thin enough, but if not, like you definitely want to make sure you patch it up well, and be really careful if you're trying to stretch it.
One more question, or a few more questions. Is it okay if the dough has olive oil? It's obviously it was in the bowl overnight and the bowl had olive oil in it. What if the dough still has a bunch of oil like at the surface? Is that okay?
Yeah, so if your dough is like, I guess if it feels like it's drowning in olive oil, you can just like pat it down really gently with like a towel, a kitchen towel or something. But I've never done that before. What I do is like by dipping it in the flour on both sides, it kind of like coats that oil. So I wouldn't worry again too much, but if it does feel like it's drowning, you can sort of like pat it and remove some of that oil.
Using the triangle method, the rim of the pizza keeps disappearing. Any tips?
Yeah, so first of all, it's not really that big of a deal if your rim is like disappearing necessarily. The way that your crust rises is both from stretching your dough and stretching out that middle, but also putting weight in the middle and putting toppings on. So even if, for example, you like press down some of your rim, it's still gonna actually rise a little bit just because it doesn't have that weight of the toppings. But just if you're using the triangle method, I would just make sure that your hands are not like fully on the crust. Try to get them kind of close to the center as possible. And that can kind of help. But if you look at my dough, you know, there isn't like a super defined rim anymore. It has stretched out. So don't worry too much. You're not looking necessarily for a really, really defined rim.
Those are all the questions in the chat at this point.
Okay, awesome. So I'm going to show the next phase. And again, I'm just double checking, making sure my dough is not sticking. I'll put a little bit more flour on my peel. So I just lift up the bottom of my pizza and put the flour down. And then I'll put my sauce on. So again, you're really not going to need more than probably like a quarter cup of your sauce on this pizza. In fact, I probably only use like 2 or 3 tablespoons to keep it light. And so what I'll do is I'll put my sauce in the center of the pizza, and then I'll use the back of my spoon, or if you have a small ladle, you can do this, and I just move my sauce and spread it out in like concentric circles all the way up to the crust. So that's my sauce, and you can see it's not like fully doused in sauce. There are some kind of, you know, like areas that there's a little bit, it's less dispersed. Again, you only need really like a couple of tablespoons, but you can use up to, you know, 4 tablespoons if you'd like. And again, I'm checking and making sure that my peel is not, my pizza is not sticking to my peel. So then I'll arrange my cheese. And again, with the cheese, you really don't need too much cheese either. I'm just gonna put some shreds here and there. And the other thing I was gonna say about the cheese is that depending on how long it takes your pizza to cook in the oven, sometimes your cheese can like spread out a lot. And so if you are someone that really likes having kind of like defined pieces of cheese on your pizza, you can put some more cheese on your pizza like halfway through. So you have some that's like fully spread out and then some that's in these like little chunks. And then I'm just gonna put a little bit, a really small drizzle of olive oil on top. And that's it. Again, my basil is gonna go on my pizza at the end after it finishes cooking and it comes out of the oven. And then I have my pizza ready. I'm gonna do a final check. I have my sauce, I have my cheese, and I'm gonna launch it in my oven.
So we've got a couple more questions. Is now a good time?
Yeah, let me just quickly talk through the oven situation and then we can do some questions. So I'm gonna offer like a couple of different ways that you can cook your pizza. I have my pizza in the oven on my middle rack. It's cooking and it'll probably take the equipment that I'm using about 2 to 3 minutes before the bottom crust is browned. If you're using a baking sheet or something, that might take a little bit longer. That could take like 5 or 6 minutes. And there's like 2 options. So you can basically cook your pizza like just again on the parchment for like the whole time. So that could take like 5 or 6 or 7 minutes until it's browned. Sometimes if you broil your pizza, you can get a nice like browner, bubbly crust on top. So what I do is I transfer my pizza from my middle rack to the top rack of my oven, and I broil my pizza for about 30 seconds to a minute to get the top really browned. But you totally don't have to do this. It can be a little bit tricky to transfer it to another rack. And so what I would recommend is, again, like option 1 is that you just cook your pizza directly on the bake method, and it can take anywhere between 4 minutes to 6 or 7 minutes, depending on how browned you like your pizza. If you want that really nice brown top, you can transfer it to the top rack and turn your broiler on and broil it for 30 seconds to 1 minute. And if you don't have a peel, the way that you can transfer your pizza is you can either use tongs or like a metal spatula and transfer it to the top rack. And the other thing that you want to make sure is if you're broiling your pizza, you're going to want to take your parchment out. So again, you can use tongs or something like that to just quickly remove your parchment and transfer it. That's a little bit more complicated, but I wanted to offer kind of like the world of options that you can have to get the pizza to be what you want it to. But the easiest way is just to bake your pizza, on the middle rack or on the bottom rack for, somewhere between 4, 7, 8 minutes until it's nicely browned on the bottom.
Awesome. So a few questions.
Yeah.
How about for baking sheet folks? So if you're using the parchment method, how do you transfer it to the baking sheet? If you're using, what's the process there?
Yeah, so if you're using a baking sheet or you don't have a peel or anything like that, what I like to do is I will just put I'll just put the parchment on top, like just imagine that this peel is a cutting board. So I'll just put my parchment with my pizza on top of a cutting board or something. And then I basically just slide the pizza with the parchment into the oven. The thing that you want to make sure is, for example, just pretend that this is like a baking sheet, or anytime you're really sliding your pizza into the oven, what you want to make sure is that, say this is my cutting board with the parchment on top and my pizza, you want to make sure that you don't slide it at an angle, because if you do, your toppings will fall off. You want to make sure that your cutting board or whatever you're using is really parallel as much as possible. It can have a slight angle so that you can shimmy it off, but like a very slight to parallel angle with your baking sheet. Make sure that it's fully like above the sheet. So again, you don't have half of your pizza hanging off, and then you can basically just, again, kind of shimmy your parchment with your pizza on top of your baking sheet.
Great. Another question. I've always coated my pizza with some olive oil before the sauce. Is that a yes, a no, an option?
Yes, that can be an option. Just give me 1 sec, because I'm just going to transfer my pizza to the broil, and then I'll answer that question. All right, so oil, yes, you can, I know some people do put oil on the bottom before their sauce. What I would imagine that does is it probably maybe gives a little bit of browning to that like portion of the crust between the sauce and the bottom. So you can absolutely do that. I tend to do it on top just to give kind of like the sauce itself a little bit like mixed in with the olive oil to give it a little more flavor. But I know definitely people put it on the bottom too. So I don't think that there's necessarily like a right way, just the preferred way that you like.
Great. If I want to put black olives on it or any other toppings on it, when do you put them on?
Yeah, so I would put any sort of toppings before it goes into the oven. So with the cheese and everything like that.
Does the order matter? If you do sauce, topping, cheese, what's your methodology?
Yeah, so when I'm baking it, honestly, the way I feel like I spread it out, it's not like there's one thing on top of the other. Generally, I think I put cheese on the bottom and toppings on the top, but order is also, again, up to you. But I prefer to do cheese on top and then toppings above that. Okay, just taking that pizza out.
One other question: if you're using the baking sheet, do you need to coat it with anything non-stick, or just leave it as it is?
No, you shouldn't need to coat it with anything. I would also say for the baking sheet method, like using parchment is probably the best thing, just because depending on the size of your baking sheet, it can be, even if you have a peel, it can be like a little bit tricky to shimmy your peel onto a baking sheet. So definitely if you have parchment, you absolutely don't need to coat your baking sheet in anything. Awesome. Okay, and then the other thing I was just gonna say was, I mentioned like when you're shimming your pizza into the oven, you really don't want to do it at an angle. So I just want to show as well for the peel, same thing. If you have your peel, you want to make sure that it's directly on top of your pizza stone or whatever you're using. And you're just gonna do kind of like a light shimmy once it's directly on top. Avoid doing the angle because that's sort of how your pizza can kind of fall over itself. All right, so I'm gonna show you my pizza. So you can see that it's cooked in the oven. It took about 4 or 5 minutes. It was 3 minutes on the baking steel that I use that gets the brown, like the bottom of the pizza nice and brown. And then I finished it under the broiler for about 1 minute, which got the top nice and bubbly. So that's kind of like the extent that you can go, but like this happens, you know, when you're using all of like the best equipment, when you're using the broiler and the bake. So definitely, you know, don't feel like you need to hack your oven right now to do like the most extensive things. If you just bake your pizza for about, you know, somewhere between 4 to 7 minutes, it's still gonna come out really nice and great.
Another question. Can I put the pizza with the baking sheet inside my cast iron skillet?
Okay, so if you're gonna use a cast iron skillet, what I would recommend actually, if your oven is already really hot and preheated, you may not want to do this, but what I would recommend is actually using your skillet upside down. And so that way you don't have as much trouble getting your your pizza onto it. So I'm just gonna show you. So this is what I would recommend, like preheating your oven with the cast iron upside down, and then it has a flat surface. And I would just put your pizza, like if you have parchment paper, I would build your pizza on the parchment and put it on top of this cast iron directly. You don't need both a baking sheet and a cast iron.
How long do you think I need to bake it if it's on a pizza stone?
Yeah, so one I would recommend, because everyone's oven and equipment is different, I would just recommend, again, like maybe using some tongs or a metal spatula to check under your pizza probably after the 3 minute mark on your stone. It should be nice and browned, but it might take another minute or so. And to get the top browned, if you're not broiling, it could take another couple of minutes.
How long? My outdoor grill gets a lot hotter than my oven. Any tips for cooking on the grill?
Yeah, so I have actually never done this myself, but I know that people that use their grills, they'll actually have like, I think your pizza stone, depending on which one you have, can actually go onto the grill. So I think what a lot of people do is really similar. They'll preheat their pizza stone on their grill, and then they'll put their pizza directly on the stone. And so that's the best way to get your pizza on like a flat surface. And I've heard really great things about it, but I haven't done it myself.
Are there any changes that you recommend if I use a pan pizza style?
Okay, I'm wondering if this question is saying like if I want to make a pan pizza or if I'm using like the cast iron pan pizza.
I'm not sure, but we'll see. Not a cast iron.
Okay, right. Yeah, so if you're using a pan pizza method, so like you want to kind of have like either a thicker crust or something and you're building it in your pan, what I've done in the past is, well, 2 things. There's like really thin crust pizza that's like bar pizza. And so what you can do is like if you have your pizza pan, when you take your pizza dough like out of the fridge and it comes to room temperature, you can actually just spread it onto that pan so it spreads all over. And then you can just put your sauce and toppings on top and put your pan with your pizza like directly into the oven. If you were doing it on a cast iron pan, for example, and doing a similar like pan pizza style, what people typically do is they'll like preheat their cast iron pan and put it on your gas stove or electric stove or whatever, and then they'll put the dough onto the hot pan, spread it out, and then put their sauce and toppings on, and then like finish cooking it in the oven. So hopefully one of those 2 responses was helpful.
We got another question. If you want to not make your own dough, is there a store-bought dough you like in a pinch?
Yes. So I really like the Whole Foods pizza dough. And I would just recommend looking at when you buy the dough, it's often much bigger than like a 12-inch pizza, for example. So you'll sometimes need to divide it into like 2 pizza dough balls. I would use the same balling method that we used yesterday. Ball your dough and let it sit out at room temperature for several hours, which will help ensure that it stretches properly and it's relaxed.
Here's my pizza.
Oh, beautiful.
I mean, it's not brown. I didn't do the broiler, but
Oh, it looks like a perfect circle.
so I'll try it.
Looks great. Yeah, and you can always leave it in the oven a little bit longer to brown as well. Eventually, even leaving it in the oven longer will brown the top too.
If people wish to make one of their balls of dough into a pizza tonight and then freeze the other one, how do you recommend freezing it so that you maintain it in the ball shape?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I personally do not freeze my pizza dough because I think it changes the texture a little bit, but I have done it. So I would just recommend putting it in like an airtight plastic bag or something like that. And then you can put it in your freezer. And when you take it out, just make sure, again, you're going to need a longer defrost period. So you're probably going to have it, probably going to take several hours to defrost. And I typically just defrost it in that like bag. So I can, demonstrate my second pizza as other people are making theirs. And
one very key question.
yeah,
Please clarify if making the pizza on parchment, what is the parchment sitting on if you don't have a peel or pizza stone or steel in your oven? So if you're making it on parchment, what is it then going on in your oven?
So if it's not going on a steel or a stone, it can go on the back of a cast iron, like an upside down cast iron pan or an upside down baking sheet. So I will just continue demonstrating kind of this next pizza, but feel free to keep asking questions. I'll be doing a little less talking and just more demonstrating so I can answer questions as I'm doing this.
And as Karishma is demonstrating, and I know that a few people have finished their pizzas, so we'd love you to stay and make your second one. If for some reason if you wish to go eat dinner, that's also totally understandable. I just want to remind you all to take a picture of your pizza and post it on social media, tag the Home Cooking Collective, use the hashtag Brandeis Women. Feel free to tag any of the Brandeis social media channels, as well as if you're a member of the Brandeis Women Facebook group, feel free to post your pictures there. We would love to see your pizzas. And obviously the class is not done, but I know that some of your pizzas are out of the oven.
Yeah, and also after you make your first pizza, if you have questions around like, I want it to be more browned, I want it to be more bubbly, I'm also happy to troubleshoot with you. Some of that kind of requires just playing around with your oven a little bit, leaving your pizza in longer. So happy to assist there.
Another question, to follow up on the parchment, if you're using the parchment paper, if you're making your pizza on the parchment paper, when you're transferring it to the oven, what are you putting the parchment paper on so that it's not flimsy?
Oh, got it. Yeah. So you're gonna put your parchment paper on the thinnest cutting board that you have. So mine is quite thick. But you're gonna put the pizza with the parchment paper on top of a cutting board, and then you're just gonna gently shimmy your pizza with the parchment into the oven off the cutting board. That's kind of the easiest way to do it. The other way that you can actually do it is if there are two of you, you can also lift each person can lift one side of the parchment with pizza on it and just put it directly in the oven. But the easiest thing is honestly just a cutting board. Just put it on the cutting board and shimmy it on top of whatever you're using, a baking sheet, into the oven.
If you're baking 2 pizzas at once, does it take longer or is it the same process?
So I've actually never baked 2 at the same time. I typically do 1 at a time because I think it's a little bit easier to control. I would say it could take a little bit longer because you have both of them in the oven. So it might take you like 50% longer to bake 2 of them at the same time.
Another question. If I put my pizza on parchment paper and inside the cast iron skillet, but the edges are not browning, what can I do?
Okay, that's a good question. So yeah, I think it kind of depends on if it's like, is the bottom browning or the top not browning? So if the bottom is not browning, you're probably just gonna have to leave it in the oven, like in that same place for a little bit longer. If you're not seeing the edges browning, again, you can leave it for another couple minutes or so and it can start browning the edges. But the biggest thing is kind of if you're able to put your pizza under the broiler, that's the best way to get it to brown. Putting your cast iron, putting the pizza in the skillet does block some of that heat. So that could be why it's happening as well. And the last piece too is if you're able to take the parchment out, so once the pizza has cooked for a couple of minutes, the bottom of the crust should have hardened a little bit. So if you're able to kind of just use tongs and take the parchment out, that can also help the edges brown a little bit more.
Another question, how do you make certain that you don't overcook your pizza?
Okay, that's a great question. So essentially, yeah, the longer your pizza sits in the oven, the more it dries out. And obviously, you know, if you put your pizza in the oven for 1 minute, it's going to be still very wet. So I would say definitely use a combination of time and what you're seeing. So if your pizza's been in the oven for like 8, 9, 10 minutes, and you notice that it looks like quite brown on the edges or it starts to look a little bit crackery, that means that it's probably overcooked. But I would say like anything under like 7 minutes or so, it should be okay, but it is going to be crispier at 7 minutes than it would be at like 4 or 5.
You've answered all the questions in the chat so far.
Great. And yeah, hopefully, I know like there's, you know, a lot going on here, but hopefully it's a fun experience for everyone to experiment and play around with. You know, the more pizzas you make, the more practice you get. And so you can try to, you know, really hone and perfect the pizza making skills.
While you're shaping your pizza, Karishma, can you remind everyone what temperature the oven is supposed to be at?
Yes, the oven is supposed to be essentially as hot as it can possibly get. So my oven goes to 550. Some people's go to 500, but you're really trying to get it as hot as possible. The hotter your oven is, the less time it takes to cook and get those browned edges without drying out the pizza. I was talking to, when we were talking to Rebecca earlier, she mentioned that her like baking sheet, for example, specifically has like a max temperature. So that's the only other thing I would check. If you're using like a standard baking sheet or cast iron pan, you can have it that hot. But if you're using any sort of specialized equipment, just double check that your oven can go that high.
If you're making one pizza and freezing the dough, can you freeze half of the dough before it rises, or should you let it rise and then freeze?
Yeah, so I would recommend letting your dough rise in the fridge for that 24-hour pizza or 24-hour rise, and then freezing it. So then when you take it out of the freezer, all it has to do is fully defrost.
And then another question for you, Karishma. What's the best pizza you've ever had and where, or is it one that you made?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, so well, one of the best pizzas I've ever had was in Naples, Italy. It was just a very classic Neapolitan margherita pizza, and it was absolutely delicious. So that one was up there. I also do really love Roberta's Pizza in Brooklyn, which this recipe is adapted from. It's like a really nice thin crust pizza. And I recently got an outdoor pizza oven, so I've been making pizzas there, and that oven gets to 900, 1,000 degrees. So
Wow.
make some really, really good pizzas. Are there any other questions on troubleshooting or anything like that?
I think that you've answered everything so far in the chat, but as soon as I say that, more questions appear. So we'll give it a couple of seconds.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
People want to come over to your house after the pandemic for some pizza.
Oh my gosh, well, anyone is welcome after the pandemic for sure. Actually, it's really funny because since it's an outdoor pizza oven, I've been able to have friends over for the last few months just outside in our backyard to make pizzas. It's like one of the only things that we can do.
Can you talk a little bit more about other classes that you offer and how can people find them?
Yeah, so I offer a number of group and private workshops. So for like my more public group workshops, I currently have an upcoming workshop later this month that's on Indian cooking. So it's like understanding spices. We'll make a dal together. We'll make some raita. So that's like a basics to Indian cooking. If you've ever been intimidated by that, I'll probably have a couple more Indian classes. And then I currently also have a bunch of private workshops. So I do like focaccia, handmade pasta, things like that.
Another question. In the past, I've had trouble with undercooked crusts where it looks cooked on the bottom, but in the middle, it's still wet and raw. What are some of the common causes of this?
Yeah, so that can depend. I would say if your crust is too thick, it can then it'll be harder to get that middle cooked. So the thinner your pizza is, less time it's gonna take to kind of cook through in the middle. So that could be like one thing. Like if you're making a thick crust pizza, it's gonna take a longer time in the oven. And that's also like trying to figure out the best temperature. So if you were making a really thick pizza, like if you were making like a 1-inch pizza, like a Sicilian pizza, it's a little bit trickier to use it at a higher temperature because it's gonna it might cook the outside faster than the inside. So it's a little bit of a combination of like what temperature you're using, how thick your pizza dough is. The other thing is if you have like a ton of sauce and toppings, that can also like make your pizza almost taste like a little soggy and like it's wet in the middle, but like the outer parts might be browner. And I would also just say, if you liked the pizza making process, having something like a pizza stone in your oven or having a pizza peel can make the process a lot easier, so that you're not playing around with parchment or moving things from one rack to the other. So that's what I would also recommend is if you really liked this process, just having some of the right equipment can also make it a lot easier of a process too.
We're getting a lot of thank yous. We're mindful of time that everyone had carved out an hour for this awesome class. And we wanted to thank Karishma for leading us through this 2-day workshop series, teaching us all how to make pizza. Again, please follow her on Instagram, look at her website, The Home Cooking Collective, sign up for more of her classes. She's a great, incredibly knowledgeable resource in the culinary world. And we're lucky to have her as part of the Brandeis community.